Hey guys, tonight we're doing something that will either make you nostalgic or make you feel deeply relieved that you live in the era you do. We're talking about dating, not the modern swipe left, ghost someone after 3 dates, lowercase everything kind of dating. I mean the whole arc. From the days when you had to sit in someone's parlour being evaluated by their mother like a piece of furniture at an estate sale, all the way to right now, where your entire romantic future can be decided by a blurry photo and whether you listed your height correctly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a huge heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and honestly, your timing is impeccable. Comments like yours are what shape this channel, and I genuinely mean that. Leave me a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always somewhere past midnight somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. Also, the channel is now on Spotify. The link is in the description, so you can listen while you do literally anything else with your hands. Now, dim those lights, turn on a fan, pull the covers up, get comfortable, and let's take a breath together. Because tonight we're asking the important questions. Did people in the 1800s actually enjoy courting, or were they just performing enjoyment because a chaperone was watching? What happened the first time someone sent a love letter and got absolutely no response? Did anyone in the Victorian era ever actually like the person they were told to marry, or was it mostly just acceptable levels of disappointment? What was flirting before texting? What was rejection before being left on read? And what exactly did people lose when romance stopped being a slow, candlelit ritual and became something you could do on your phone in a waiting room? Congratulations, you've just woken up somewhere in the middle of the whole beautiful, ridiculous human experiment of trying to find someone to tolerate forever. The year doesn't matter yet. What matters is that people have always wanted the same thing, and the ways they went about getting it are somehow both deeply strange and completely recognizable. Let's begin. Long before anyone expected to feel butterflies, a pounding heart, or the electric discomfort of being noticed by someone attractive across a crowded room, marriage was simply a contract. Practical, businesslike, and about as emotionally charged as agreeing on the price of grain. In most ancient and medieval societies, the idea that you might actually like the person you were bound to for life was considered a charming bonus at best, and a dangerous distraction at worst. Parents arranged matches based on land, wealth, alliances, and social standing, the way you might compare mortgage terms today, except the mortgage had a pulse and opinions. Think about what that actually means for a moment. You are, say, 16 years old. You have spent your entire short life in one village, one household, one very small radius of human experience. And one day your father sits you down and informs you that you will be marrying the son of the neighbouring landowner, a young man you may have seen twice, spoken to perhaps once, and formed no particular feelings about either way. That's it, that's the announcement. There's no conversation about compatibility. No one asks how you feel. The question of whether you find him interesting, kind, or even remotely tolerable has simply not come up because it is not the relevant metric. The relevant metric is whether his family's fields are adjacent to yours, and whether the arrangement will prevent a property dispute. And here's the thing that's hard to sit with from a modern vantage point. This wasn't considered cruel. It was considered responsible. Love, in the medieval and early modern understanding, was something that happened after marriage if you were lucky. A slow growth of familiarity and interdependence that might or might not ripen into genuine affection over decades of shared hardship. It wasn't the foundation. It was, at best, a pleasant afterthought. Ancient Rome had a term for this: matrimonium. The word is rooted in the Latin for mother, because the institution's primary purpose was the production of legitimate heirs. Not happiness, not companionship, heirs. You were a mechanism for continuity, and the person you married was selected accordingly. The Roman upper classes arranged marriages for children as young as 7, with the actual union to follow at puberty. The girl had no legal standing to refuse. The boy had marginally more input, which is to say, almost none. This pattern held across cultures and centuries with variations in ceremony, but almost none in principle. In medieval Europe, the Church added a theological layer, marriage as a sacrament, indissoluble and divinely sanctioned, but the actual selection process remained firmly in the hands of families, not individuals. A young noblewoman in 13th century France was as unlikely to choose her own husband as she was to choose her own surname, which she also didn't choose. What's remarkable, though, is that within these arranged arrangements, love sometimes happened anyway. Letters survive from medieval and early modern couples that are surprisingly tender, full of worry and longing and the small intimate details that accumulate between two people who have spent years learning each other's rhythms. People found ways to care for the person they had been assigned. They made the best of it. They had to. But there's a difference between making the best of something and being given a choice. And for most of human history, in most of the world, the choice simply wasn't part of the package. Romance as a prerequisite for marriage, the idea that you ought to feel something before you commit, is an extraordinarily recent development. For most people who ever lived, love wasn't how it started. It was something you hoped might show up later, like good weather. If there is one figure who has done more unsung damage to the early stages of romance than any other in history, it is the chaperone, that watchful, usually older, frequently bored third party, whose entire job was to make sure nothing interesting ever happened between two people who wanted nothing more than to talk alone for 5 minutes. In the Victorian era and well beyond, no respectable young woman could be left unchaperoned with a man she wasn't related to, which meant that the beginning stages of courtship played out as a kind of absurdist theatre, with everyone performing their best version of polite indifference, while secretly hoping the chaperone would fall asleep. The chaperone could be a mother, an aunt, an older sister, a family friend, or occasionally a companion hired specifically for the purpose. She would sit in the corner of the parlour, close enough to hear every word, far enough to maintain the fiction of privacy, doing needlework or pretending to read, while the two young people across from her attempted to have a conversation that was simultaneously meaningful, decorous, and entirely devoid of anything that might be considered forward. This is harder than it sounds. Try expressing genuine romantic interest in someone while a middle-aged woman 3 feet away is audibly turning pages. The rules were elaborate and somewhat deranged. A young woman could not walk unchaperoned with a man who was not her immediate family member. She could not ride in a closed carriage with him alone. She could not receive him at home if no other adult was present. She certainly could not be alone with him after dark under any circumstances whatsoever, unless she was comfortable with having her reputation destroyed before breakfast. The chaperone was the physical embodiment of all those rules, present in the room to ensure they were followed and to witness that nothing scandalous had occurred. What this produced, practically speaking, was a generation of young people who became extraordinarily skilled at communicating through indirection. You couldn't say what you meant, so you said something else entirely and hoped the other person understood. You couldn't touch, so a brushed hand while passing a teacup became significant enough to think about for 3 days. You couldn't be alone, so every public occasion became a highly coded performance, in which the real conversation happened entirely below the surface of the spoken one. In some ways, this produced a kind of romantic intensity that the modern era, with its direct texts and immediate access, has largely lost. When you cannot say anything directly, everything you do say acquires weight. A prolonged glance, a specific flower chosen from the garden, the decision to stand slightly closer during a walk than was strictly necessary. These things mattered in a way they simply don't when you can send a paragraph about your feelings at any hour without consequence. But let's not romanticize it too heavily. The chaperone system was also, at its core, a mechanism for controlling women. The concern was not truly about romantic propriety in the abstract. It was about female virtue as a commodity, about ensuring that a young woman arrived at her wedding in a state that would satisfy the expectations of her future husband and his family. The chaperone was not there for her protection. She was there to protect her value, and the young men, for their part, operated with considerably more freedom. A man's reputation for a bit of premarital wandering was considered colourful, if not actively admirable. The rules were not symmetrical. They never were. In the 19th century, if you were interested in someone, you didn't send them a message. You didn't like their post. You didn't even write them a letter straight away. You sent a calling card, a small, formally printed rectangle of cardstock bearing your name, sometimes your address, and absolutely nothing else. No context, no explanation, no indication of your feelings, your intentions, or whether you were funny. Just your name, hand-delivered by a servant, placed on a silver tray, and left to do all the emotional heavy lifting on its own. Whether she was home, whether she received it, whether she chose to receive you on your return visit, all of it was a coded performance governed by rules that could take years to master. The card itself was subject to precise etiquette. The size, the typeface, the quality of the paper all communicated social standing. Folding a corner of the card in a specific direction indicated that you had delivered it in person rather than through a servant, which implied greater sincerity. Different corners meant different things in different households and different cities, which meant that if you hadn't been properly schooled in the code, you might accidentally be communicating something entirely unintended, like congratulations, when you meant to express condolences, or vice versa. Both are bad. If the lady of the house chose not to receive you, her servant would relay that she was not at home. This was almost always a fiction. She was frequently at home. She simply did not wish to see you. But the fiction was maintained with such rigorous consistency that it became a social standard, one of those polite lies that everyone understood and no one was expected to challenge. You nodded, took your hat, and left, understanding without being told that you had been evaluated and found insufficient. If you were received, you were shown into the parlour and given approximately 15 to 30 minutes in which to make your case, conduct yourself well, and leave a favourable impression, all under the watchful presence of whoever had been appointed to sit nearby, and ensure that your visit remained strictly within the bounds of the acceptable. 15 minutes. That was your window. Modern first dates last at least an hour and still feel insufficient. These people were expected to determine marital potential in the time it takes to watch half an episode of a television show. What's quietly extraordinary about the calling card system is how much social scaffolding it required simply to get two people into the same room. The card, the servant, the tray, the decision to receive or not, the visit itself, the reciprocal card, the follow-up. Each stage was governed by rules, each departure from the rules was noticed, and the whole elaborate machinery existed to accomplish something that today takes approximately 4 seconds and a swipe. It's tempting to call it inefficient, but it was also, in its way, a system that demanded seriousness of intention. You didn't go through all that for nothing. Among the stranger courtship practices in early American history is one that sounds, on the surface, completely impossible, and yet was enthusiastically practiced across New England and parts of Europe for centuries. It was called bundling, and it involved a courting couple being placed in the same bed together, often with a wooden board between them, or with the young woman sewn into a bundling bag from the waist down, and then left largely unsupervised for the night. The logic, such as it was, held that since heating a colonial home in winter was expensive and laborious, this arrangement allowed a visiting suitor to stay overnight and converse with the young woman without wasting firewood, and, in theory, without any impropriety occurring. In theory. Bundling was practised with enough consistency throughout colonial New England and in parts of Wales, Scotland, and the Netherlands from which many American settlers had come, that it was considered a perfectly ordinary feature of rural courtship. A young man would travel, sometimes considerable distances, to court a young woman whose family he was interested in allying with. Travelling home the same night was impractical. Paying for an inn was an expense most families couldn't justify. And so, the practical solution was to put the suitor in the young woman's bed, separate them with whatever barrier the family considered adequate, and trust to virtue, wool, and the presence of a thin board of wood to keep things respectable. The bundling board was the star of the arrangement, a plank placed vertically between the two parties, the medieval equivalent of a terms of service agreement that both parties had technically agreed to, but that was, depending on the individual character, observed with varying degrees of commitment. Some accounts suggest the boards were as tall as a foot. Others suggest they were more symbolic than structural. Either way, they were being asked to do a great deal of moral work for a piece of lumber. What bundling actually produced, according to records that survive from the period, was a great deal of very earnest conversation. Long nights in which two people, lying in the dark, talked in ways they couldn't easily talk in daylight with family present. Names, plans, fears, opinions about the harvest, whether they thought they could build a life together. The darkness and the closeness produced an intimacy that the formal parlour visit never quite managed, which is possibly why bundling persisted as long as it did despite the obvious structural risks. It also produced, according to various 18th century observers who were not pleased about this, a notable rate of premarital pregnancy in communities where it was practised, which is, honestly, not the most surprising outcome when you examine the mechanics of the arrangement with any clarity. Puritan ministers thundered against it. Some colonial assemblies discussed legislating against it, but it persisted, because families with cold houses and inconveniently located suitors were not particularly moved by thundering, and because at the end of the day, the alternative was asking a young man to ride home at midnight in a Massachusetts winter, which was also unacceptable. Bundling faded as homes became better heated, and as the growing middle class adopted more urban, formal courtship practices in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. But it lasted long enough to be practiced by people whose descendants would, 2 or 3 generations later, be horrified to hear of it. Before the red receipt existed to destroy people emotionally, there was the love letter, a carefully composed, sometimes agonizingly crafted piece of paper that travelled at the speed of a horse and arrived, eventually, at the hands of the person you were trying not to seem too desperate about. The love letter was, for centuries, the primary technology of romantic pursuit, and it carried an enormous amount of psychological weight. You couldn't unsend it. You couldn't softly edit it the morning after. Whatever you wrote in ink in your own hand was now a permanent document that the recipient could keep, share, laugh at with her sisters, or produce as evidence in a breach of promise lawsuit, which was a real legal proceeding. Writing a love letter well was a skill, and not a trivial one. For the literate classes, the ability to compose an eloquent expression of feeling was considered a genuine marker of character and intelligence, which meant that a badly written love letter didn't just fail to impress, it actively worked against you. You could be witty, tender, earnest, or poetic, but you could not be clumsy, because clumsy was the thing you didn't recover from. There were, in the 18th and 19th centuries, actual published guides to letter writing that included model love letters for various stages of courtship, essentially romantic templates for people who had feelings but insufficient vocabulary to express them without help. The waiting was its own particular torture. You wrote the letter, you sealed it with wax, you sent it, and then you waited. Days, sometimes. A week, if the distance was significant, during which time you had absolutely no way of knowing whether it had arrived, whether it had been read, what the recipient had felt upon reading it, or whether your carefully chosen words had landed as intended, or produced exactly the wrong impression. The letter existed in a state of pure uncertainty until a reply came, and in that gap between sending and receiving the imagination did its worst. The reply itself was governed by its own etiquette. A prompt reply was encouraging. It suggested eagerness, attention, genuine feeling. A slow reply was ambiguous. It might mean consideration, busyness, or the gentle preliminary to a refusal. No reply at all was a message, and an unambiguous one, though it left you no words to process, only silence, which it turns out is not easier to sit with just because it arrives by mail. What love letters gave you, though, that no subsequent technology has quite replicated, was a sense of the person on the page. Handwriting was individual in a way that a typed message is not. The pressure of the pen, the style of the capitals, whether the words ran uphill or down across the page, all of it was evidence of a specific human being sitting somewhere in a specific room with specific feelings, making choices about how to express them to you. When Napoleon wrote to Josephine from military campaigns, rambling, obsessive, occasionally grammatically alarming letters that she mostly did not reply to promptly, you could feel the man through the ink, his impatience, his longing, his complete unwillingness to play it cool. That quality of presence is hard to transmit in a text message. The love letter also required commitment in a way that modern communication simply does not. You had to mean it enough to sit down and write it. That friction was not nothing. If the idea of a breakup making you feel embarrassed, sad, and temporarily unable to listen to certain songs feels manageable by modern standards, consider for a moment what a broken engagement meant in the 19th century. It wasn't just socially uncomfortable, it was potentially a legal matter. Breach of promise suits, lawsuits filed by a jilted party, almost always a woman, against the person who had promised to marry them and then didn't, were a legitimate and surprisingly common feature of Victorian and Edwardian legal life. Women could sue for damages, for the money they had spent preparing for a wedding, for the income they had lost by turning down other suitors, and for the reputational harm of being publicly associated with a man who had changed his mind. The logic behind breach of promise law was rooted in the economic reality of women's lives in the 19th century. A woman who accepted a proposal and announced an engagement had, by that act, removed herself from the marriage market. Other potential suitors had moved on. She had perhaps refused other offers while waiting to be married. She had invested time, emotional energy, and frequently real money in preparations. And if the man then withdrew, for whatever reason, or no reason, she was left in a position that was materially and socially worse than the one she'd been in before he asked. The law recognised this as a form of injury, and the courts agreed to compensate for it. Cases ranged from the straightforward to the spectacular. A man who had clearly made a firm promise, in writing or in front of witnesses, and then married someone else, was in serious legal jeopardy. But the definition of a promise was contested territory. Had he said he wanted to marry her, or that he intended to? Had there been a formal announcement, or merely an understanding? Was there correspondence that could be produced? Were there witnesses who had heard him speak of her as his future wife? All of it was evidence. All of it was argued over in court, sometimes at considerable length and public amusement, because breach of promise cases were reliably entertaining, and newspapers covered them in the spirit in which modern media covers celebrity divorces. The damages awarded were sometimes enormous. Juries, made up entirely of men, were nonetheless capable of considerable sympathy for the humiliated woman before them, particularly if her lawyer had been skillful in presenting her dignity and distress. Some women recovered enough to be genuinely comfortable. Others used the threat of suit as leverage to extract a private settlement, the 19th century equivalent of a quietly negotiated severance. A man who knew that ending things could cost him a significant public judgment was perhaps more careful about who he proposed to, and how firmly, and in front of how many witnesses. What breach of promise law ultimately represented was an acknowledgement that romantic promises had real-world consequences, that entering into and then abandoning a serious romantic commitment was not a purely private matter between two people, but an act with economic and social ripple effects that the law had an interest in addressing. It was a strange system, built on a set of assumptions about women's dependence that feminist reformers would rightly challenge in the 20th century. But it also took seriously the idea that someone's heart and circumstances could be genuinely damaged by a broken promise. which is a recognition that the purely private, entirely commitment-free model of modern dating sometimes seems to have abandoned entirely. In the 19th century, when the rules of polite society made it nearly impossible to express a genuine emotion directly without causing a small social catastrophe, people got creative. They developed an entire system of coded communication using flowers, a practice known as floriography, in which each bloom carried a specific meaning, and a carefully assembled bouquet could communicate paragraphs of feeling without a single word being spoken. A red rose meant passionate love, which everyone knows, but a yellow rose meant jealousy, or a dying affection. A forget-me-not meant true love and remembrance. A petunia meant resentment. A striped carnation meant refusal. The implications of getting this wrong were significant. You could send someone a carefully assembled bouquet that you believed communicated warmth and admiration, and inadvertently convey, through an imprecise flower choice, that you were jealous, resentful, and considering ending things. You could receive a posy from an admirer and spend 3 days consulting your floriography dictionary, trying to determine whether he was declaring love or warning you that he found your conversation tedious. The flowers were a language, but like all languages, they were subject to regional variations and the ever-present problem of the sender and receiver having read different editions of the dictionary. The practice had deeper roots than Victorian parlour games. Flowers had carried symbolic meaning in cultures across the ancient world, in Greek myth, in Islamic poetry, in the Japanese tradition of Hanakotoba, where flowers communicated meaning with even greater specificity than the Victorian system. But in 19th century Britain and America, floriography became something of an obsession. Dictionaries were published. Ladies' magazines ran guides. Young women collected pressed flowers with their associated meanings, organising them in albums the way a modern person might curate a playlist. The act of giving flowers thus became extraordinarily loaded. The choice of bloom, the combination, the condition in which they were delivered, fresh or slightly wilted, arranged formally or loosely with leaves or without, whether they were presented in the right hand or the left, facing toward the giver or the receiver, were all said to carry meaning. This gave the gift of flowers a density of possible interpretation that a single bouquet from a modern petrol station simply cannot compete with. What florography gave people was a way to say the unsayable, to communicate romantic feeling in a form that could be received, enjoyed, and understood, without anyone having to admit out loud what was being communicated. This was useful in a society where a direct declaration of feeling could be considered presumptuous, embarrassing, or socially inappropriate before a certain stage of courtship had been formally established. The flowers did the work that words weren't yet permitted to do. And if someone sent you striped carnations, the formal floriographic signal for refusal, you at least had the dignity of receiving a rejection in a form that smelled better than a letter and could be put in a vase while you processed your feelings. Before dating apps could algorithmically deliver compatible strangers to your phone screen, the question of how two people, who might be suited for each other, were supposed to actually meet was one that society spent enormous energy managing, mostly through highly controlled social occasions that gave the appearance of spontaneity while ensuring that everything happening was, in fact, heavily supervised. The Sunday church service was perhaps the most reliable of these, a weekly gathering where the entire community assembled in their best clothes, sat in assigned or traditional pews, and had the opportunity to observe and be observed in a setting where any overt display of romantic interest would be immediately witnessed by everyone, including your grandmother. The church meeting was a master class in covert romantic communication. You couldn't speak freely. You could barely turn your head. But you could be seen walking in, taking your seat, being well dressed and composed, singing with a clear voice, behaving impeccably throughout the sermon, and lingering appropriately afterward in the churchyard where the real business of the social occasion actually occurred. The half hour after the Sunday service, when the congregation milled about in the open air and made polite conversation before dispersing, was probably the most productive social networking event of the entire week in most rural communities across several centuries of European and American life. The chaperoned walk served a similar function with slightly different mechanics. A young man might be permitted to walk with a young woman and her accompanying adult, usually on a well-travelled public path where they would encounter other members of the community and be seen to be doing nothing inappropriate. The conversation during these walks was the real substance. You learnt things walking that you couldn't learn in a parlour, how someone moved through the world, whether they noticed things, whether their conversation had range beyond the performative topics that parlour visits demanded. A walk lasted long enough for the polished surface to wear slightly thin and something more genuine to emerge, occasionally. The underlying anxiety of all these supervised encounters was the same. How do you determine whether you genuinely like someone when you're never allowed to be alone with them, and every interaction is a performance with an audience? The honest answer is that you frequently couldn't. You made your best guess based on incomplete information, compressed into brief formal encounters that revealed very little about how a person actually lived. And then you either proceeded or you didn't, on the basis of evidence that a modern person would consider wholly insufficient. What these structures gave you, though, and this is easy to overlook, was community knowledge. Everyone in a small parish or a neighbourhood had been observing the same pool of eligible people for years. Character was known, history was known, family was known. The supervised encounter was not your only source of information about a potential partner. It was just the formal one. The informal information had been accumulating for years. If you wanted to get a sense of what early-stage Victorian courtship actually looked like in practice, you need to picture a parlour, a specific formal room in a respectable household that existed almost entirely for the purpose of receiving callers and conducting the opening stages of romantic negotiation under conditions of maximum visibility. The parlour was not a comfortable room. It was a performance space, furnished with the family's best items, kept slightly too warm, and presided over at a discreet distance by a mother, aunt, or elder sister, whose mere presence ensured that nothing untoward would occur and that everything said would be measured, rehearsed, and impeccably dull. The furniture itself enforced a certain social posture. Victorian parlour chairs were not designed for relaxation. They were designed for sitting upright at a specific angle that communicated moral rectitude and decent breeding. The horsehair upholstery was uncomfortable enough to discourage any temptation toward physical ease. The room was crowded with the family's display objects, china, framed photographs, ornamental items that signalled prosperity and taste, and every one of those objects could be turned into a topic of polite conversation if the actual conversation ran dry, which it frequently did, because no one could say anything they actually meant. What was said in parlours, if you read the surviving accounts and manuals of the period, was almost comically inoffensive. The weather, the health of mutual acquaintances, a recent publication of general interest, the condition of the roads, whether a particular musical performance had been enjoyable. These were the acceptable topics of a first or second call, because they allowed two people to speak to each other without either one having to reveal a single genuine thought, preference, or feeling. You were essentially conducting an extended audition in which the role you were auditioning for was your own future self, and the casting director was a woman sitting 6 feet away pretending to embroider. And yet, real information was transmitted in spite of everything. How a young man sat, whether he listened as well as he spoke, whether his humour was gentle or barbed, whether he asked questions or merely waited for his turn to talk, all of it was observable. Whether a young woman's opinions, offered carefully and decorously, suggested a mind worth spending a lifetime with, that too was perceptible to someone paying attention. The parlour stripped away the physical setting and most of the behavioural cues that modern daters rely on. You couldn't take them to a concert and see how they responded to music, or to a dinner and see how they treated the waiter. But it gave you conversation, and conversation, if you knew how to read it, gave you something. The visits were expected to follow a declining schedule of frequency that itself communicated the trajectory of the relationship. A first visit might be followed by a reciprocal card, a second by a slightly longer call. Increasing regularity of visiting implied increasing seriousness of intention. The whole thing operated on an understood timeline that neither party needed to explicitly discuss. Another example of the Victorian genius for communicating through structure rather than words. The romantic practices that fill history books, the calling cards, the chaperoned promenades, the carefully worded letters, the elaborate wedding announcements, were, almost without exception, the practices of people with enough money and social standing to make the rules in the first place. For the majority of people throughout history, courtship was a far more pragmatic affair, shaped less by the rituals of polite society and more by the grinding realities of economic survival. A working-class woman in the 1800s wasn't worried about whether a suitor's calling card was correctly engraved. She was calculating whether his wages could cover the rent, whether he drank too heavily, and whether marrying him would make her situation better or worse than it already was. The dowry system, which existed in various forms across virtually every culture in recorded history, made the economic dimension of marriage not just implicit, but explicit and contractual. A bride's family transferred money, property, land, livestock or goods to the groom's family at the time of marriage. This was partly about providing for the bride's future welfare. It was also, more bluntly, a payment for the groom's willingness to take on a wife, a recognition that in most historical economies, women's labour was valued less than men's, and that a new wife came with costs that the groom's household would need to absorb. The dowry was the offset. The size of a dowry determined a great deal. A woman with a substantial dowry could attract a better match, wealthier, higher in social standing with better prospects. A woman with a small or non-existent dowry was working with a significantly reduced field of candidates and might find herself accepting someone she would otherwise have declined, simply because the alternatives were worse. Love might enter into the calculation. It sometimes did. But it entered into it after the financial terms had been established, not before. For men without property, marriage was equally instrumental. A labouring man in 18th century England didn't marry until he could demonstrate the economic foundation necessary to support a household. This often meant waiting until his late 20s or 30s, until he had saved enough, inherited enough, or secured a position stable enough to justify the expense of a wife and potential children. Romance that couldn't be supported financially was simply a luxury he couldn't act on. Working-class courtship, when it happened, was thus strikingly direct compared to its upper-class equivalent. There was no budget for parlour visits and calling cards, no network of social occasions at which eligible people could perform for each other under supervision. You met someone at work or at church or in the street or through a neighbour. You talked. You determined whether the practical basis for a marriage existed, and if it did, you proceeded, not with proposals and engagement parties and seasons of formal visiting, but with a handshake, an understanding between families, and a trip to the church. The sentiment was not absent, but it was not the point. This pragmatism, which the middle and upper classes often characterized as coarseness, was in many ways simply honesty. It acknowledged, without the elaborate social theatre, that marriage was an economic arrangement with emotional dimensions rather than an emotional arrangement with economic dimensions, a distinction that most people in history understood, and that the romantic idealism of the 19th century was, in a sense, working very hard to obscure. Long before any tech company claimed to have cracked the code of human compatibility, there existed in almost every culture on Earth a figure who served the same essential function, the matchmaker. Called a shachan in Jewish tradition, a nakodo in Japan, a go-between in countless other societies, the matchmaker was a professional intermediary who knew the social landscape of a community intimately and whose job was to identify compatible pairings, negotiate the terms of their introduction, and shepherd the whole thing toward a successful conclusion, or at least toward an official engagement, which was considered success enough. The matchmaker was part social worker, part gossip network, and part contract lawyer. What the matchmaker actually knew, and what made them valuable, was not a compatibility algorithm or a personality test. It was something harder to quantify. A detailed, granular understanding of every family in their community accumulated over years of observation, conversation, and the kind of information that only travels through trusted networks. They knew who had a temper, who drank, whose father had debts that weren't publicly acknowledged, which family was in quiet decline and which was ascending, whose son was genuinely kind, and whose was only kind in front of company. This was information that formal social occasions could not produce, and that a young woman's family often couldn't access independently. The matchmaker was the database, and the database was human. In Ashkenazi Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, the shadchan was a fixture of social life for centuries, operating under a system in which families approached them with their requirements: a daughter of good character and modest means, a son with a trade and respectable family, whatever the specific needs were, and the shadchan proposed candidates, arranged meetings, negotiated the terms, and collected a fee upon a successful engagement. The system was practical to the point of poetry. You had something you needed. They had knowledge you lacked. An exchange was made. Love was invited to arrive afterward, and frequently did. The nakodo in Japan operated similarly, acting not just as an introducer, but as a long-term relationship broker, someone who facilitated the initial meeting in an omiai, the formal arrangement where two families and their eligible children met in a supervised setting to evaluate the potential match, and who remained involved afterward as a mediator and advisor. The nakodo was responsible in a social sense for the outcome. Their reputation was tied to the success of the matches they made. This gave them a professional incentive that no dating app has ever quite replicated, because Tinder does not lose anything when your relationship falls apart. The matchmaker's approach was also, in a counterintuitive way, more honest about what marriage was for than the romantic model that followed it. It did not pretend that two people meeting across a candlelit table and feeling chemistry were making a rational decision about a lifetime partnership. It acknowledged openly that a lifetime partnership involves families, finances, temperament, values, and community standing, all the things that passionate early attraction is specifically designed to make you temporarily ignore. The matchmaker looked at all of it and tried to find a fit that would survive the wearing off of novelty. The model has not disappeared. Matchmaking services still exist in dozens of cultures worldwide, from traditional community-based systems in South Asia to high-end luxury matchmakers serving wealthy urban professionals in New York and London, who have decided that they would like someone else to take the search off their hands. The medium has changed. The function hasn't. People still want someone who knows the landscape to point them in the right direction. They just call it something different now. The tightly regulated world of Victorian parlours and calling cards assumed a certain kind of society, stable, settled, and populated by enough respectable families to sustain the machinery of polite courtship. The American West in the latter half of the 19th century was none of those things. It was a place of profound demographic imbalance, where men vastly outnumbered women in most frontier communities, where the usual social structures hadn't yet formed, and where the question of finding a partner sometimes had to be addressed through means that the Eastern establishment found either charming or deeply alarming, depending on who you asked. Men placed advertisements in newspapers. Women answered them. Marriages were sometimes arranged entirely through correspondence, with the bride travelling hundreds of miles to meet a husband she had never seen. The demographic reality of the frontier was stark. In the California gold rush of 1849, men outnumbered women by ratios of up to 12-1 in some mining communities. In the early cattle and farming territories of Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas in the decades that followed, the imbalance was less extreme but persistent. Communities of men who had staked land claims, built homesteads, and established the beginnings of a viable livelihood found themselves without the social infrastructure through which courtship was supposed to happen. No dances, no church socials, no network of families with daughters of marriageable age within a reasonable distance. The frontier rewarded resourcefulness, Resourceful men adapted. The matrimonial advertisement was their adaptation. Placed in newspapers with broad circulation, the matrimonial journals that began appearing in the 1860s and 70s, or in general papers that ran personal columns, these notices were models of compressed practical communication. A man would describe himself in the most favourable terms he could honestly sustain, specify what he was looking for, and invite correspondence. A woman in the East or Midwest, perhaps facing limited local options of her own, might read several such advertisements and begin a correspondence with one or more of the men who seemed most promising. What happened next was essentially the 19th century equivalent of a long-distance online relationship, conducted entirely through letters over weeks or months. Both parties were working with incomplete information and an obvious incentive to present themselves favourably, which meant that deception was a genuine risk and arrival was sometimes a shock. Men who had described themselves as prosperous farmers were occasionally found to be occupying a claim that consisted of a one-room sod house and an optimistic attitude. Women who had described themselves in attractively modest terms were not always what their letters had implied. The meeting in person, after all those weeks of correspondence-based intimacy, could go spectacularly right or spectacularly wrong, and both outcomes were reported in the press with equal enthusiasm. What's remarkable, though, is how often it worked. Women who made the journey did so with clear eyes about what they were entering: a hard life, a new place, a stranger for a husband. They were not naive. They were making a calculated choice, often from a position of limited alternatives, to take a risk on something new. And the marriages that resulted when they held were sometimes built on a foundation of practical compatibility and mutual respect that the more romantically elaborated courtships of the East did not reliably produce. The frontier, in stripping away the ceremony and the social scaffolding, revealed something that the formal system preferred to keep hidden: that the essentials of a workable marriage were not the ones that parlour visits and calling cards were designed to evaluate. The mail-order bride phenomenon of the American frontier is the most dramatic version of what was, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, a surprisingly common practice, conducting a courtship almost entirely through letters, with both parties building a complete picture of the other from nothing but handwriting, vocabulary, and whatever details they chose to disclose. The stakes were extraordinary. You were not merely choosing whether to continue seeing someone you had met at a party. You were agreeing to travel to an unfamiliar place, marry a stranger, and begin a life with them based on an exchange of correspondence that could have been, and sometimes was, almost entirely fictional. The photograph helped. Once photographic technology became accessible enough that exchanging images was practical. A studio portrait, formal and carefully posed, gave you a face, which was better than nothing, though it was also the most controlled and least revealing version of a face that anyone could possibly send you. Victorian and Edwardian portrait photography required subjects to hold still for extended periods, which meant that the photographs exchanged in postal courtships were uniformly composed, carefully lit, and completely expressionless. You were looking at a face that had been specifically arranged not to communicate anything inadvertent, which is not nothing, but is also not much. What the letters revealed, to a careful reader, was considerably more. Literacy itself was information, not just the ability to read and write, which was not universal, but the quality of the prose, the range of vocabulary, the rhythm of the sentences. A man who wrote in clipped functional sentences revealed something about himself. A man who wrote with humour and self-awareness revealed something different. A woman whose letters were careful and formal might be reserved. One whose letters were frank and occasionally funny might be someone worth the journey. People read these things with the attention of literary critics because the stakes warranted it. The letters also created a peculiar intimacy that face-to-face courtship, with all its supervision and performance requirements, often failed to generate. Writing to someone you had never met, across a distance that made the interaction inherently private, could produce a frankness that was simply not available in person. You said things in letters that you couldn't say in a parlour. You asked questions that a chaperone's presence would have made impossible. The correspondence became a space in which two people talked to each other more honestly than the rules of polite society usually allowed, and the relationship that developed in that space was sometimes, in its way, more real than many relationships that developed under conventional conditions. The danger, of course, was that the person at the other end of the correspondence was not the person you arrived to meet. The gap between self-presentation in letters and actual personality in person could be significant. People described themselves generously. They omitted things. They wrote the best version of themselves, week after week, and the best version of yourself is not the version that shows up at breakfast after a bad night's sleep, which is the version your future spouse is going to encounter most frequently. What postal courtship reveals, at its core, is that people have always been willing to take considerable risks for the possibility of genuine connection, that the desire to find someone is strong enough to override sensible caution, cross enormous distances, and marry a stranger on the basis of a handful of letters and a stiff studio photograph. Some things, it turns out, do not change very much. For much of the 18th and 19th centuries, the formal dance was one of the few genuinely exciting social occasions at which young men and women could interact in a semi-supervised but physically proximate way, which is precisely why every element of it was governed by rules so elaborate they could fill a small manual. Who you danced with, how many times you danced with the same person, whether you sat out a dance together, whether you spoke during the dance, what you said, all of it was coded with social meaning and carefully observed by everyone in the room. Dancing too frequently with the same partner implied an attachment. Refusing a dance without a convincing excuse was a snub, and the waltz, which required partners to hold each other at the waist and look directly at each other while moving, was considered so dangerously intimate when it first appeared that more than one commentator described it as scandalous. The waltz arrived in England and America from continental Europe in the early 19th century, and the reaction from guardians of public morality was immediate and extraordinary. Lord Byron called it lascivious. The Times of London published a poem condemning it. Chaperones who had managed the sedate movements of the minuet and the country dance found themselves confronted with a form in which a young man placed his hand on a young woman's waist, and they moved in close rotation together for several minutes, their faces level with each other, their bodies closer than social convention had previously permitted outside of a medical examination. The outrage was not purely performative. The waltz genuinely changed what a dance could do. The dance card was the social technology deployed to manage all of this. Before the evening began, a young woman would receive a small card, sometimes attached to a pencil on a ribbon, listing the dances of the evening, and gentlemen would request specific dances in advance, writing their names against the corresponding slots. The card was a social document of some significance. A full card meant you were in demand. A conspicuously empty card was a public humiliation, and a card that showed the same name more than twice or 3 times was raising eyebrows across the room, because everyone present understood the mathematics of dance card allocation and its implications. The conversation that happened during the dance itself was constrained by the movement, but liberated by the noise and the proximity. You couldn't be overheard easily on a crowded floor with musicians playing. You could say things in 3 minutes of a waltz that might take 3 parlour visits to approach by other means. There are accounts of proposals made on dance floors, of confessions of feeling, of negotiations conducted in whispers over the noise of a string quartet. The dance was the one context in which 2 people were simultaneously physically close, temporarily separated from their chaperones, and surrounded by enough noise and activity to provide the cover of relative privacy. For this reason, the supper dance, the dance immediately before the supper interval, during which the partner you danced with would accompany you to supper and be your companion for the extended break, was the most significant dance of the evening. To assign the supper dance was to make a statement. To be asked for it was to have been chosen in a way that everyone in the room would notice and remember and discuss for at least the following week. A great deal of 19th century romantic history was made during supper dances. It's the kind of detail that makes you understand why people took dancing so seriously. By the early 20th century, the Victorian rigidity of courtship had relaxed only slightly, replaced by a different kind of performance, the leisurely social occasion at which middle and upper-class young people could interact in the open air, under the benign supervision of parents sitting at a respectful distance, and engage in conversations carefully calibrated to reveal absolutely nothing of genuine personal significance. The Edwardian lawn party, the garden fete, the country house weekend, these were the theatres of Edwardian courtship, and the script required that any real feeling be buried so deeply under layers of pleasantry that it would take an archaeologist to locate it. The country house weekend deserves particular attention because it represented an entire social institution built around the management of romantic possibility under conditions of extended proximity. You arrived on Friday, you stayed through Sunday, you ate meals with the same group of people, took walks with them, played croquet and lawn tennis with them, sat with them in the evenings while someone played the piano. You had, over the course of 2.5 days, more sustained access to the actual texture of a person's character and company than any number of formal parlour calls could have provided. And yet the rules still applied. You did not say what you meant. You did not express direct feeling. You navigated. A young man who found a young woman interesting would engineer situations in which they could talk, positioning himself near her during the pre-dinner gathering, finding reasons to cross her path on the morning walk, managing the seating arrangement for afternoon tea in whatever way the social architecture permitted. A young woman who found a young man worth knowing would make herself available to these engineered moments, responding to his conversational gambits with enough warmth to encourage without enough directness to be considered forward. The Edwardian period was, in retrospect, the last gasp of this elaborate performance before the First World War dismantled the world that had produced it. The young men who attended those summer lawn parties in 1912 and 1913 were, within 2 years, dead in extraordinary numbers in the fields of France and Belgium. The women who had waited for them to work through the proper channels of courtship were left with a generation of potential partners simply gone. After that, the argument for waiting politely and saying nothing meaningful for the correct number of seasons before acknowledging a feeling became considerably harder to make. What the Edwardian social occasion gave you, for all its constraints, was time in the same space as another human being. The slow, unstructured time in which people become real to each other in ways that a 45-minute first date in a wine bar cannot approximate. The conversation might be anodyne, but the person could not be entirely concealed. Over a weekend of meals and walks and evening gatherings, character emerged in spite of the script. Whether that was worth the elaborate performance required to access it is a question that each generation since has answered slightly differently. What's consistent is the underlying impulse, the desire to spend enough time with someone under sufficiently relaxed conditions to determine whether they are actually worth spending more time with. The mechanisms change, the goal does not. The 1920s did not gently nudge courtship customs in a new direction. They detonated them. In the space of a single decade, the chaperoned parlour visit gave way to the unsupervised automobile ride, the modest ankle-length dress gave way to the raised hemline, and the slow, coded exchange of calling cards gave way to the direct, often startlingly frank communication of a generation that had watched a world war kill off an entire cohort of young men and decided that waiting politely was no longer a viable strategy. The flapper did not ask permission to be interesting. She simply was, loudly and without apology, and the young men who found her fascinating were not handed a rulebook by their mothers about how to proceed. They were mostly left to figure it out. The automobile was the single most transformative technology of 1920s courtship, and its effect was so immediate and so obvious that moral reformers were discussing it within years of its widespread adoption. The automobile provided something that courtship had never previously had: genuine privacy. A young couple who drove together out of town, away from the neighbourhood, away from the parlour and the chaperone and the watching eyes of the community, existed temporarily in a space where nobody knew where they were and nobody could see what they were doing. This was an unprecedented development. The car made private the thing that had always, by design, been public. Parents were alarmed. Clergy were alarmed. Social commentators wrote extensively about the automobile as a moral hazard. Studies were conducted. Youth organisations passed resolutions. None of it made the slightest difference, because the freedom the automobile offered was real, and the argument for curtailing it was essentially an argument for going back to the world before the war, which nobody particularly wanted to do. The jazz club, the speakeasy, the dance hall, the new social spaces of the 20s offered something else that the Victorian drawing room had never provided: physical expression as a form of romantic communication. The new dances, the Charleston, the Black Bottom, the Foxtrot, were fast, close, and entirely different in character from the supervised waltzes of the previous generation. They required physical coordination, a degree of abandon, a willingness to be seen having fun. These were not qualities that the Victorian parlour had valued. The 1920s valued almost nothing else. Women smoked in public. Women drank in public. Women expressed opinions about men and romantic arrangements with a directness that would have been considered disqualifying a decade earlier. The language of courtship changed. It became faster, more colloquial, more honest about physical attraction, in a way that the elaborate flower language and coded correspondence of the Victorian period had been specifically designed to avoid. You could say what you meant, at least in some circles, at least some of the time, and the sky did not fall. What the 20s demonstrated in the end was that the elaborate machinery of formal courtship had been held in place not by any deep human preference for indirection, but by a set of social rules maintained by community pressure, family authority, and the economic vulnerability of women who couldn't afford to step outside the rules. When those pressures relaxed even slightly, the machinery came apart with startling speed. What was left was something messier, louder, less certain, and for many people, considerably more alive. The concept of going on a date, two people spending time together in a social setting with the explicit, mutually understood purpose of evaluating romantic compatibility, is a surprisingly modern invention, one that emerged in the early 20th century as young people began to have more economic independence, more physical mobility, and fewer chaperones following them around. The soda fountain was one of the first public spaces where this new kind of courtship became normal, a place where a young man could invite a young woman to sit with him, share something sweet, talk without a mother in the adjacent armchair, and begin the process of deciding whether they liked each other as actual people, rather than as representative members of compatible families. The word date itself, in its romantic sense, emerged in American slang in the early 1900s, derived from the same root as a diary date, an appointment, a scheduled occurrence, and its casualness was part of its novelty. A date was not a formal call. It was not a chaperoned walk with family observation and social consequences. It was two people choosing each other's company, going somewhere together and seeing what happened. The informality was the point. The point was also, and this is worth pausing on, that someone paid for things, and that someone was expected to be the young man. The economics of the date shifted something important in the courtship dynamic. Under the older parlour visit system, a young man visited a woman's home, was received by her family, and operated within a social space that she and her family controlled. He was the petitioner. The date moved the action out of the home and into commercial spaces, restaurants, movie theatres, amusement parks, later drive-in cinemas, spaces that he paid for, which gave him a kind of authority that the parlour visit had not. Whether this was an improvement is a question that feminists would raise with considerable clarity some decades later. The movie theatre deserves particular recognition as a venue of courtship history. Darkened, anonymous, providing 90 minutes of shared experience without requiring either party to produce continuous conversation, it was almost perfectly designed for the early stages of romantic evaluation. You could observe each other's reactions. You had something to discuss afterward. You were sitting close together in the dark in a way that was entirely public and entirely private at the same time. The cinema became, from the 1910s onward, one of the most reliable first-date venues in the English-speaking world, a status it has maintained for over a century and shows no particular signs of relinquishing. The drive-in cinema, which flourished in the 1940s and 50s and declined only with the spread of home television, added the dimension of the automobile back into the equation. Privacy, proximity, and a windshield as the only barrier between you and everything your parents had been worried about since the 1920s. The drive-in became so thoroughly associated with teenage romantic activity that its cultural reputation survived long after the physical venues themselves mostly closed. What the date gave people was agency, the ability to choose, individually and without family management, who to spend time with and in what context. It gave them practice in the art of romantic self-presentation outside a supervised environment. And it gave them the experience, new in human history, of failing a date, of spending an evening with someone and concluding privately, at some point during the entrees, that this was not going anywhere, and having to see it through to the end regardless. A skill that previous generations had never needed and that modern people have spent considerable time developing. By the 1950s, American courtship had evolved into a highly ritualized system of its own that, while very different from the Victorian parlour visit, was in some ways just as rule-governed and just as publicly performed. Going steady, the exclusive formalised arrangement by which a young couple declared themselves to be each other's, and only each other's, was not merely a private understanding. It was announced. It was symbolised. It was marked by the transfer of a class ring or a letter jacket, items worn visibly by the girl to communicate to everyone around her that she was taken, that someone had claimed her, and that anyone else interested should direct their attention elsewhere. The whole system was a social broadcast, and its terms were understood by everyone. Going steady had a specific logic in the social ecology of the 1950s high school and college. The dating culture of the preceding decades had been characterized by a practice sometimes called playing the field, dating multiple people casually, without commitment, gathering experience and social capital, before eventually narrowing towards something serious. Going steady was the step that announced a narrowing. It said, "Of all the people available to me, I've selected this one, and I'm temporarily removing myself from consideration by anyone else." The ring on her finger, not an engagement ring, not yet, but a class ring usually worn on a chain or wrapped in tape to fit, was the evidence. The pressure to go steady ran in complicated directions. Girls were expected to want it, because exclusive commitment offered social protection. A steady boyfriend meant you were chosen, which in the social logic of the era reflected well on your desirability. Boys were expected to offer it when the relationship reached a sufficient stage of seriousness, and failing to offer it when expected was a social offence. But boys who went steady too young or too easily were sometimes accused of sacrificing social freedom prematurely. The whole apparatus required careful navigation. What Going Steady also did was create a formalised pre-engagement stage that gave young people a framework for practising the skills of a committed relationship: fidelity, regular communication, the social presentation of being a couple, without the full legal and economic commitment of engagement or marriage. It was, in retrospect, a sensible staging mechanism. You got to practice before the stakes became permanent. The physical markers were taken seriously. Returning a letter jacket or a ring was a breakup in material form. You didn't just stop seeing someone, you gave back the object publicly, which meant the termination of the relationship was as visible as its beginning had been. There was no ambiguous fade, there was no soft ghosting. There was a return of property and a social fact that the community around you processed in real time. Whether that was better or worse than the modern alternative probably depends on your personality and your specific situation, but it was unambiguous, which is a quality that modern romantic communication often conspicuously lacks. The domestic telephone, which began appearing in middle-class American homes in the early 20th century and became nearly universal by mid-century, changed courtship in ways that its inventors certainly did not intend and could not have fully anticipated. For the first time in history, two people who were interested in each other could speak directly, in real time, without either being in the same physical space or the same written exchange, and could do so with a degree of privacy that the parlour visit or the chaperoned walk had never permitted. This was thrilling, and also immediately terrifying, because calling someone you liked required you to pick up the phone, dial the number, and wait while it rang, knowing that any member of their household might answer, knowing that they might say you just missed her, knowing that the conversation, if it happened, would be conducted without the benefit of being able to see the other person's face. The parental interception was one of the great underappreciated anxieties of mid-century courtship. The telephone was in the kitchen, or the hallway, or the living room, somewhere in the household's shared space with no privacy and excellent acoustics. When a young man called a young woman, he frequently got her father first, or her mother, or a younger sibling who would shout her name up the stairs and then hover in the vicinity listening with obvious and unself-conscious interest. The conversation that followed was conducted in the knowledge that any member of the household might be within earshot at any moment. This was not the unchaperoned privacy that the automobile had offered. This was a different kind of supervised intimacy. Telephone courtship in the presence of everyone who lived there. The rules around telephone calls were absorbed rather than stated. You didn't call too early, you didn't call too late, you didn't call too frequently, because frequent calls implied a desperation that was considered unattractive by the social standards of the era. You didn't speak for too long, because long calls tied up the household line, a practical constraint in the days of party lines and limited telephone infrastructure that became a social norm that outlasted the technology that had created it. 2 or 3 times a week was considered appropriate for a developing relationship. More than that was discussed. What the telephone gave courtship that letters had not was tone, the actual sound of another person's voice, carrying information that written words could not. You could hear nervousness, warmth, amusement, hesitation. You could hear whether someone was genuinely happy to hear from you or merely being polite, in a way that the careful prose of a letter could mask entirely. The voice was uncontrollable in a way that writing was not. It revealed things. Some people were better on the phone than in person, and discovered this about themselves with some surprise. Others were worse, and found that the absence of visual cues turned them awkward and monosyllabic in ways that didn't reflect their actual personalities. Asking someone on a date by telephone required a specific courage, the willingness to propose something real time, to hear the answer in the same breath, with no delay for composure or careful word choosing. The rejection that arrived by telephone arrived immediately, in a voice, with no buffer. This was, by the standards of what came later, still a relatively high-stakes form of communication. It demanded presence of mind and an ability to recover gracefully in real time, skills that have not entirely survived into the era of the text invitation, where you can wait to read the answer until you feel sufficiently braced for it. Long before dating apps, long before the internet, long before it was considered entirely normal to browse strangers based on thumbnail photographs and curated descriptions, there were the personals, small, compressed, desperately earnest advertisements placed in the back pages of newspapers and magazines by people who had, for one reason or another, not found a suitable partner through the usual channels and were willing to be public about it. The personal ad had a long history stretching back to the 18th century, when British newspapers first began running matrimonial advertisements from men of means seeking companionable wives. By the 20th century it had evolved into a recognisable form, a few lines of self-description, a few lines of what one was seeking, and a box number to write to, because nothing said romantic possibility quite like a box number. The personal ad was an act of considerable social courage for most of its history. In a culture that maintained that suitable people met through suitable channels, through friends, through family, through the organic social encounters of community life, publicly advertising for a partner implied that those channels had been tried and had failed, or that you existed somehow outside them. The stigma was real. People who placed and responded to personal ads did not, for most of the 20th century, tell the story at dinner parties. They told a different story, one involving a mutual friend or a chance encounter, and they maintained that story for years. The language of the personal ad evolved its own compressed conventions that anyone who read the back pages of newspapers or magazines from the 1960s onward will recognise. WLTM, would like to meet. GSOH, good sense of humour, a phrase that appeared in essentially every personal ad ever written, because nobody was advertising for a humorless partner, and the phrase had lost all meaning through overuse. NES, non-smoker. OHACE, own house and car, which communicated financial stability in 4 letters. The whole vocabulary was a code that regular readers learned to parse quickly, screening in seconds for the factors that mattered and moving on. The self-description portion was where human optimism met the constraints of available column inches. You had roughly 40 words to explain who you were and why someone should want to meet you, which turned out to be a surprisingly good exercise in identifying what you actually thought your most valuable qualities were. People tended to describe themselves in terms of physical appearance first, height, build, a favourable adjective or two, and then profession, and then character, in roughly that order of priority. What the personal ad revealed, in aggregate, was what people thought other people wanted in roughly 40 words, which was not always the same as what they actually wanted, or what would have actually made them happy. The box number reply was its own particular ritual. You wrote a letter, a real letter, on paper, to a number at a newspaper office, and the paper forwarded it. The anonymity on both ends meant that the first exchange was genuinely between 2 people who knew almost nothing about each other except what fit in the ad and what fit in the letter. It was slow, uncertain, and entirely possible to sustain across several exchanges before meeting in person, which, given the stakes, was probably wise. The 1960s did not merely change what people did in private, they changed what people felt they were allowed to feel, want, and say about wanting it. The sexual revolution, fueled by the widespread availability of the birth control pill from 1960 onward, by the civil rights movement's broader challenge to social hierarchies, and by a generational rejection of what the post-war suburban 50s had seemed to represent, dismantled the carefully constructed courtship system of the preceding generation with a speed that left many people who had operated within that system genuinely disoriented. The idea that a woman's romantic value was tied to her sexual unavailability, an assumption that had shaped courtship practices for centuries, was challenged directly and loudly. The pill was the hinge on which everything turned. For the first time in human history, women had access to a reliable, female-controlled method of contraception that was entirely separable from the act itself, no negotiation required, no male cooperation needed, no after-the-fact hoping for the best. This was not a small thing, it was an enormous thing. The link between sexual activity and the potential consequences that had made female sexual restraint a practical, as well as a moral necessity, was not broken, but it was significantly loosened. And when it loosened, the entire moral architecture built on top of it began to shift. College campuses became the laboratories of this shift in the United States and much of Western Europe. The generations entering universities in the mid-1960s had grown up with the going steady system, the letter jackets, the carefully staged progression from first date to formal commitment. They arrived in an environment that offered independence from parental supervision for the first time, a peer culture that was actively questioning the assumptions of the previous generation, and a contraceptive technology that separated physical intimacy from its most feared consequence. The rules they had been raised with stopped applying, and nothing had yet been written to replace them. What emerged instead was a culture of deliberate informality around romantic and physical arrangements that was both genuinely liberating and genuinely confusing, sometimes simultaneously and sometimes for the same person. The idea that two people could be physically intimate without it constituting a commitment, without it meaning anything specific about the future, without the woman involved being subject to the social penalties that had previously accompanied premarital sexual activity. This was new, and it took time to work out what it meant in practice. It meant different things to different people. For many women, the pill and the broader feminist consciousness of the period offered real freedom, the ability to make choices about their own bodies and romantic lives that their mothers had not had. For others, the dismantling of the old rules created a new pressure, the implicit expectation that the old protections against sexual pressure no longer applied, that refusing was now old-fashioned rather than reasonable, that liberation meant being available. The sexual revolution was not a clean story of progress. It was a complicated renegotiation of who had power over whom, conducted at speed, in public, without a script. What it did to courtship specifically was remove the assumption that romantic pursuit was necessarily heading somewhere permanent. Dating became a thing people did without a clear destination in view. Living together without marriage became first scandalous, then notable, then ordinary. The staged progression from meeting to courtship to engagement to marriage, the pipeline that the entire Victorian machinery had been designed to manage, became optional, which was, depending on who you were and when you lived it, either the best thing that ever happened to you or the beginning of a very long period of uncertainty. Among the many social questions that the feminist movements of the 1960s and 70s raised and refused to leave politely unanswered was one that touched directly on the mechanics of modern dating. Who, exactly, was supposed to pay for dinner? This sounds trivial, but it was embedded in a much larger question about what dating was actually for and what the exchange of money at a restaurant table was symbolizing. The traditional model in which a man paid for an evening out carried a set of implied assumptions about the relative economic positions of men and women, about who was pursuing whom, and about what was being offered and what was expected in return. Feminism looked at those assumptions and said, not unreasonably, that they were worth examining. The argument for the man paying had its roots in a world where women's economic dependence on men was structural and real. A woman who was financially dependent on a future husband had every practical reason to expect that a man pursuing her would bear the costs of courtship, the dinners, the theatre tickets, the flowers, the demonstrations of ability to provide that the whole dating ritual was partly designed to communicate. The man paid because he could, because she generally couldn't equally, and because the payment was a signal of both means and intention. In a world of significant economic inequality between men and women, this arrangement had a coherent logic. Second-wave feminism identified that coherent logic and pointed out where it led. If the man always paid, then the date was something he was providing and she was receiving, which cast her as a passive beneficiary of his generosity, rather than an equal participant in a mutual experience. If the payment was a signal of his ability to provide for her, then it also reinforced the assumption that she needed providing for. And if there was an implied expectation of reciprocity attached to the payment, not necessarily explicit, not necessarily acknowledged, but present nonetheless in the social atmosphere of the date, then the woman who accepted the dinner was accepting something more complicated than a meal. Going Dutch, splitting the bill equally, became a political as well as a practical statement. Women who insisted on paying their share were signalling independence, refusing the dynamic that the traditional arrangement implied, and asserting that they were present as equals rather than as the objects of male generosity. This was not universally welcomed. Men who had been socialized to understand paying as an expression of respect and interest found the offer to split insulting or confusing. Women who were paying their own way sometimes felt that they were doing so at the cost of something they had also been socialized to want: the feeling of being valued, sought, provided for. The conversation has never fully resolved. Surveys conducted in the 21st century consistently find that significant proportions of both men and women still expect the man to pay on a first date, while also finding that significant proportions of both find this assumption outdated. What this tells you is that people are simultaneously operating from two different frameworks: the old one, absorbed from culture and family, and the new one, constructed from explicit values, and that the gap between them produces the specific awkwardness of the restaurant check arriving at the table and both parties reaching for it and nobody quite knowing what the gesture means. It is, in its way, a perfect microcosm of where modern courtship finds itself generally, caught between inherited scripts and revised values, playing out the negotiation in real time over pasta. If the telephone had introduced the anxiety of calling someone you liked, the answering machine introduced a new and distinct anxiety. The question of whether you should leave a message, what you should say in it, how long you should talk, whether you sounded normal, and whether the person was actually out, or whether they were standing 3 feet from the machine listening to your voice and deciding not to pick up. The answering machine arrived in American homes in the 1970s and spread through the 80s, and it created for the first time the experience of asynchronous romantic rejection, the message left that went unreturned, the voice that disappeared into a tape and simply never came back to you. Screening calls was the practice, and it was conducted without shame in households across the country from roughly 1980 onward. You came home, you saw the blinking light on the machine. You pressed play and listened to who had called before deciding whether and when to return the call. This gave the receiver of calls an enormous informational and temporal advantage over the caller. The caller had committed to a message, a voice, a tone, whatever words they had managed to produce under the pressure of the beep. The receiver could evaluate it at leisure, consult friends about the appropriate response time, and return the call or not with full knowledge of what they were doing. The message itself was a performance under conditions of high anxiety and zero preparation time. When the machine answered and the beep came, you had somewhere between 3 seconds and whatever nerve you could summon to begin speaking naturally, warmly, and in a way that communicated exactly the right degree of interest, enough to justify the call, not so much as to seem desperate, casual enough to suggest confidence, specific enough to give them a reason to call back. Achieving all of this simultaneously, out loud, into a machine, while aware that it was being recorded and would be played back and possibly played for other people, was genuinely difficult. The hang-up was the answering machine era's alternative to ghosting. You called, the machine answered, you lost your nerve, said nothing, and hung up, leaving, in the days before caller ID, no evidence that you had called at all. Caller ID arrived in the early 1990s and ended this particular escape route, which is why the period between the answering machine and caller ID represents a brief golden window of plausibly deniable telephone cowardice that has been closed ever since. The 3-day rule, the widely circulated social norm of the 1980s and 90s that held you should wait 3 days before calling someone after a first date to avoid appearing too eager, was a direct product of answering machine culture. The rule acknowledged that the timing of contact carried social meaning, that eagerness could be weaponized against you, and that the appearance of having other things to do was more attractive than the reality of having sat by the phone since Tuesday. It was a rule about performed indifference, and it produced a great deal of perfectly mutual indifference that both parties were actually performing, waiting 3 days in parallel, both pretending not to care, neither one actually meaning it. Entire romantic possibilities died in those 3 days, which nobody at the time seemed to find as absurd as it was. Before anyone had ever heard of an algorithm, before the internet had made it possible to browse strangers at 3 in the morning, there was the video dating service, a peculiar and now largely forgotten bridge between the personal ad and the digital age, in which people paid to record short introductory videos of themselves that other paying subscribers could then watch and, if interested, request to meet. Services like Great Expectations and VideoMate appeared in the late 1970s and flourished through the 80s and into the 90s, and they represented the first time that technology had been used specifically to create a marketplace for romantic possibility, the first time that finding a partner had been explicitly productized. The experience of joining a video dating service in, say, 1985 required a commitment of both money and self-exposure that filtered out the casually curious. You paid a membership fee, sometimes a substantial one, in the hundreds or even thousands of dollars for premium services, and you went to an office, sat in front of a camera, and recorded a short video of yourself talking about who you were and what you were looking for. This video was then available for other members to watch, and they could request to see yours, and you could request to see theirs. And if there was a mutual expression of interest, the service facilitated an introduction. The videos were, by any standard, excruciating. People sat stiffly in front of neutral backgrounds and described themselves in the third person while clearly dying slightly inside. They mentioned their hobbies, tennis, hiking, cooking, always cooking, in tones suggesting these were the most fascinating hobbies anyone had ever had. They described what they were looking for in terms so aggressively generic that the descriptions would have fit approximately 70% of the adult population. Someone who enjoys laughing, they said. Someone who is comfortable in both casual and dressy situations. Someone who is ready for something real. The videos communicated very little about the actual person, and a great deal about how the actual person imagined an attractive romantic prospect presented themselves. And yet people found partners through these services. Not in negligible numbers, in real numbers, enough to sustain a significant industry for nearly 2 decades. What the video service offered that the personal ad didn't was a face and a voice, the specific visual and auditory information that a few written lines simply couldn't carry. You could see, in 3 minutes of slightly awkward video, whether someone had a quality of presence that interested you. You could hear whether their voice was warm or flat. You could observe whether they laughed naturally or performed laughter. None of this was definitive, but all of it was real information that the words alone couldn't provide. The video dating service also made explicit something that the personal ad had kept somewhat implicit. You were shopping. You were browsing a catalogue of people, evaluating them against your preferences, selecting who to pursue and who to pass on. The commodification of romantic possibility that social critics would later identify as a feature of online dating was already fully present in the video library. The sense that somewhere in the collection was the right person, and that finding them was a matter of looking through enough options. The feeling that you were both the shopper and the product was also already present. Nobody found this comfortable. They did it anyway. In the mid-1990s, a strange new thing began to happen. People started falling in love, or something that felt very much like love, with people they had never met, never seen, and in some cases never spoken to out loud. The rise of internet chat rooms, first on services like Prodigy and CompuServe, then in enormous numbers through America Online, created for the first time a space where strangers could talk to each other in something approaching real time, using nothing but text, and discover that the feeling of being known and understood by another person could happen at a keyboard as readily as it had ever happened in person. This was unsettling to anyone who had believed that romance required physical presence. It turned out that it mostly required something else. What it required, apparently, was the right kind of conversation, the experience of expressing yourself to someone who responded with understanding, interest, and a quality of attention that felt different from the attention available in ordinary life. Chat rooms were anonymous enough that many people spoke more honestly in them than they did in face-to-face interaction. The absence of physical appearance removed a variable that ordinarily dominated early romantic evaluation, for better and worse. You could not be judged on how you looked. You were only what you said and how you said it. For people who were funny, articulate, and interesting in prose, qualities not always legible to a stranger across a bar, this was an extraordinary equalizer. The relationships that developed in AOL chat rooms in the mid to late 90s were genuinely novel in human experience. You might talk to someone for hours a day for weeks, building a detailed knowledge of their mind, their humour, their history, their fears, and still not know what they looked like, what their voice sounded like, or whether any of what they had told you was true. The intimacy was real. The knowledge was partial. The combination was intoxicating and occasionally disastrous. Meeting in person, after a significant period of online communication, was one of the defining experiences of that era. A thing that happened to enough people that it generated its own cultural vocabulary and its own set of anxieties. You had built a person in your imagination from their words, and the actual person existed separately from that construction, with a body and a voice and physical mannerisms that the text had given no indication of. Sometimes the two versions matched in ways that felt miraculous. Sometimes they didn't match at all, and you sat across a table from someone you knew intimately and felt nothing. What the chatroom era introduced into mainstream culture was the idea that a relationship could have a genuinely meaningful history before it had any physical dimension, that knowing someone could precede seeing them, that the sequence of romantic development that had held for most of human history did not have to run in that order. This seems obvious now. In 1996, it was strange enough that people wrote newspaper articles about it, sometimes in tones of mild alarm, as though the natural order of things was being quietly inverted, which, in a sense, it was. When Match.com launched in 1995, it was not an immediate social triumph. The idea of paying a service to connect you with potential romantic partners drawn from a database of strangers was, for most people who heard about it at the time, something they associated with loneliness, desperation, and the mild social stigma of having failed to find someone through the channels that were considered normal. For the first decade or so of online dating's existence, most people who used it told their friends and families that they had met their partner some other way, some more respectable way, some story involving a party or a mutual friend or a coffee shop that didn't involve admitting they'd filled out a compatibility questionnaire online at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The stigma took about 10 years to fully dissolve, and it dissolved under the weight of numbers. By the mid-2000s, enough people had met partners through online dating services that the social sample was simply too large to maintain the fiction that only desperate or socially dysfunctional people used them. Doctors used them, lawyers used them, attractive, socially capable, professionally successful people used them, because they had discovered that being attractive, socially capable, and professionally successful did not reliably solve the problem of meeting compatible people, particularly in large cities where the density of strangers made the anonymity of daily life a real obstacle to the organic meeting that the culture still theoretically preferred. The profile was the art form that online dating produced, and it was a strange one. You had a handful of photographs, a short written description, and a set of fields: age, height, location, relationship status, whether you wanted children, that were supposed to communicate enough about you to justify a stranger's investment of time in pursuing contact. The photographs were the dominant element. Studies conducted on early dating site behaviour showed that photographs received the most attention, shaped the most decisions, and did more to determine whether a profile was contacted than any amount of carefully crafted prose. This was in some ways depressing, a return to the primacy of physical appearance that the chatroom era had briefly circumvented. In other ways, it was simply honest about how human attention actually operates. The written profile became a minor literary genre, with its own recognisable conventions and its own reliable clichés. Everyone loved to laugh. Everyone was equally comfortable in jeans and a cocktail dress. Everyone was looking for someone to go on adventures with, which apparently meant hiking or foreign travel, and not, say, attempting ambitious home improvement projects. Everyone was described as sarcastic but also kind. which raised the question of what sarcastic and also kind looked like in practice on a Wednesday evening when nothing was going well. What Match and its successors actually changed more than anything else was the size of the field. Meeting people through organic social channels meant meeting people within your existing social network, friends of friends, colleagues, neighbours, people whose connection to you was already established. Online dating meant meeting people who shared no prior social context with you, whose existence you would never have known about through any other means. This was both the promise and the problem. The field was enormous. The strangers were genuinely strange, and the work of evaluating them, one profile at a time, was more labour-intensive than anyone had initially anticipated. If any single technology has reshaped the daily texture of romantic pursuit more thoroughly than anything that preceded it, it is the text message, that small, immediate, infinitely rereadable communication that made it possible to be in near constant contact with someone you were interested in, and, by the same token, made it possible to feel the withdrawal of that contact with a precision that no previous generation had ever experienced. The text thread became a record of a relationship's emotional temperature, hot when responses came quickly, worrying when they slowed, catastrophically cold when they stopped entirely. People began reading meaning into response times, punctuation choices, the presence or absence of emoji, whether a period at the end of a short sentence indicated finality, or just a period. The read receipt was a particular instrument of modern romantic torment, a small notification that informed you not only that your message had been delivered, but that it had been opened, read, and then not responded to. Previous generations had their own versions of unreturned communication, the unanswered letter, the unreturned phone call, but they came with a built-in period of plausible deniability. Perhaps it hadn't arrived yet. Perhaps they'd been busy. The read receipt eliminated all of that. They had read it. It was 11 minutes ago. They were not typing. You could see they were not typing because there was no ellipsis, no indication of composition, just the small grey word read and a timestamp and the particular silence of someone who had nothing to say to you or had decided not to say it. This speed that texting introduced into romantic communication created new anxieties that the slower pace of previous technologies had not produced. When letters took days to arrive, a slow reply was built into the medium and required no explanation. When a phone call was the primary instrument of contact, the expectation of communication was structured around a call, a discrete event with a beginning and an end, not a continuous ambient thread. Texting created the expectation of availability, of a person who was, at most moments of the day, reachable, and therefore choosing, actively and continuously, whether to reach back. Every non-reply was a decision. Every delay was something to interpret. What texting also did was create an enormous archive. Previous romantic relationships left traces, letters kept in a drawer, photographs in an album, but the daily texture of how two people had communicated with each other was largely unrecorded and therefore unreviewed. Texting archived everything automatically in a thread that you could scroll back through at any hour and reread in whatever emotional state you happened to be in, which was frequently not the state most conducive to accurate interpretation. People reread old text conversations looking for the moment things had changed, the message that had been slightly colder than the one before it, the point at which the other person had started responding with less, and sometimes found it and sometimes didn't, because the change, when it happened, was often not a single moment but a gradual cooling that only became visible in retrospect, and only then if you were looking hard enough to find it. The double text, sending a second message before the first had been responded to, became a coded act of emotional exposure, an acknowledgement that you cared enough about a reply to risk appearing to care too much. The entire calculus of romantic self-presentation that previous generations had conducted through the timing of calling cards and the frequency of parlour visits was now being conducted through response times and punctuation, and the question of who sent the last message in a thread and how long it had been sitting there unanswered, and what that meant, and whether it meant what you thought it meant, and how you found out. Tinder launched in 2013, and within a few years, the gesture of swiping right or left on a photograph had become one of the defining acts of modern romantic life, so widely understood and culturally embedded that it has entered the language as a metaphor for quick, superficial judgment in almost any context. What Tinder and the apps that followed it did to courtship was not simply to make meeting strangers easier, though it did that. It changed the architecture of the decision. It transformed the first encounter from a social event with context, unpredictability, and the presence of other people into a solo sorting exercise conducted in private, at any hour, in any location, based almost entirely on a photograph and a brief self-description that most people read in under 3 seconds. The design was deliberately, brilliantly frictionless. Previous online dating services had required investment, a detailed profile, a composed message, a period of evaluation before contact was made. Tinder removed almost all of that. You looked at a photograph, you made a snap judgment, you swiped. The whole decision took less time than it takes to read this sentence, and the volume of decisions you could make in a single sitting was essentially unlimited. This was not accidental. The design drew explicitly on the mechanics of slot machines and variable reward systems, the occasional match, arriving unpredictably, producing a small dopamine spike that encouraged continued use. The app was engineered to be compelling. It was extremely good at what it was engineered to do. What it was not engineered to do was produce relationships, which turned out to be a different project entirely from producing engagement with the app. The match was not the relationship. It was the beginning of a conversation that might lead to a meeting that might lead to something more, but the gap between matching and arriving at something real was wide and full of obstacles. The opening message, the exchange that either built momentum or didn't, the translation from text to actual human presence. All the places where the connection that had seemed possible on a screen failed to survive contact with reality. The match was the easy part. Everything after it was as hard as it had ever been. What swipe culture also introduced, more profoundly than any previous technology, was the paradox of choice operating at romantic scale. When the field is genuinely enormous, when the next potential match is always one swipe away, the investment in any individual person becomes harder to sustain. Why work through the friction of getting to know one imperfect person when the app is suggesting, implicitly and constantly, that there might be a better option just below the current card? This is not a problem that people in the era of the village parish or the arranged match had to manage. It is a problem that exists specifically because the infrastructure of romantic possibility has become so large and so accessible that the scarcity that previously forced decisive commitment has been replaced by an abundance that makes commitment feel perpetually premature. The irony is that the app designed to make meeting people easier may have made committing to people harder, not because the people it surfaces are worse, but because the architecture it creates makes the act of choosing one person and meaning it feel like closing a door that was just opened. At some point in the history of modern dating, a new practice emerged that was not entirely new in substance. People had always, in various ways, let unwanted romantic attention fade rather than addressing it directly, but was new in its pervasiveness, its name, and the degree to which it came to be understood as a recognized, normalized mode of ending things. Ghosting, the practice of simply ceasing all communication with someone you'd been romantically involved with, without explanation, without a conversation, without any of the verbal acknowledgement that the relationship had existed and was now ending, became a subject of cultural discussion in the early 2010s and has remained one, largely because it produces a specific kind of distress that is difficult to resolve precisely because it provides no information. The mechanics of ghosting are simple, and the psychology is entirely understandable. Ending a relationship, even an early stage one, requires saying something difficult to someone who may respond to that difficult thing with hurt, anger, argument, or a sustained attempt to change your mind. Ghosting avoids all of that. It simply removes you from the situation without triggering any of those responses, because there is no conversation to respond to. From the ghoster's perspective, it is efficient, painless, and requires nothing. The problem is entirely on the other side of the silence. The person who has been ghosted is left in a peculiar limbo that earlier forms of rejection had not created. A formal letter of refusal, a telephone call ending things, even the return of a letter jacket, all of these communicated something specific. They said, "This is over, and I am the one ending it." Ghosting communicates nothing specific. It could mean a dozen things. It could mean the person is not interested. It could mean they are temporarily busy. It could mean something happened to them. It could mean they are composing a response. The person who has been ghosted cannot know which of these is true, and the uncertainty is its own particular cruelty. Not because it is intended as cruelty, mostly it isn't, but because it withholds the one thing that would allow the other person to process and move on, which is a clear statement of what has actually happened. Previous generations had their versions of this: the unanswered letter, the caller who was always not at home, the suitor who stopped visiting without explanation. These were real experiences and they produced real pain, but they occurred within social structures that provided some context. A mutual friend who might know something, a community in which the parties existed together and whose observation provided at least some information. Modern ghosting occurs between people who frequently share no social context whatsoever, who met through an app, who know none of the same people, who exist for each other only in the thread on the phone that has gone quiet. The disappearance, in that context, is total. There is no community gossip to fill the silence. There is no mutual friend to ask. There is only the thread and the timestamp of the last message read, sitting there like a small, precise monument to something that apparently didn't mean enough to be ended properly. Whether the people doing it understand how it lands on the other end is the question that every article, advice column, and late-night conversation on the subject has been trying to answer, without much success, for the better part of a decade. Somewhere between the calling card left on a silver tray and the profile photo swiped past in half a second, something changed about how romantic attention was offered and received, and the question of whether that something was progress or loss is one that people are still, in various ways, working out. The old courtship rituals were slow, often stifling, deeply unequal in ways that disadvantaged women at almost every turn, and built on social structures that benefited the powerful at the expense of everyone else. No one with a clear view of the Victorian marriage market or the arranged match of the 17th century is arguing for its return. But what those slow rituals did, sometimes in spite of everything wrong with them, was impose a kind of deliberateness, a requirement that romantic interest be sustained, expressed with effort, and offered in a form that cost something. The cost is what's different now. The calling card cost effort and social exposure. The love letter cost time and vulnerability, and the permanent record of your feelings in your own handwriting. The chaperoned visit cost patience and the willingness to perform under observation. The going steady pin cost a public declaration of preference, made visibly and irrevocably in a community that would remember it. Each of these things required the person doing them to commit to the act, to put something at stake, to make a gesture that could not be easily retracted. The commitment preceded the certainty. You had to mean it before you knew whether it would work. Modern romantic technology has largely eliminated that cost structure. The swipe costs nothing, the match costs nothing, the opening message costs almost nothing, a few seconds, a few words, the tap of a send button. The relationship that might develop from those gestures is still as hard and as risky and as costly as it ever was. But the entry point has become so cheap that the meaning carried by arrival at it has diminished. Being matched with someone tells you almost nothing about whether they mean it. being messaged tells you almost nothing about the seriousness of the person messaging. The signal that effort and exposure once provided has been diluted by the ease with which the gestures are now made. What has been gained is real and significant and should not be dismissed. The pool of potential partners that modern technology makes accessible is genuinely larger and more diverse than anything previous generations could access. The ability to find someone whose specific combination of values, interests, and personality aligns with yours, someone who might never have appeared in your organic social world, is a real expansion of human possibility. The freedom from arranged marriages, from the marriage market, from the economic coercion that shaped so much historical courtship, these are not small things. They're enormous hard-won freedoms that cost previous generations real suffering to produce. But sitting somewhere in the gap between the Victorian parlour and the phone screen is a question about what romantic attention is supposed to mean, about what it communicates when someone chooses you, and whether that communication requires the choice to have been difficult. The Florography Dictionary and the breach of promise lawsuit and the dance card and the bundling board were all, in their different ways, mechanisms for making the choice mean something, for making the pursuit cost enough to signal intent, for requiring the people involved to demonstrate through the effort of the ritual itself that the person they were pursuing was worth the effort. That question, how you demonstrate in a world where demonstration has become nearly costless, that you mean it, is the one that the long, strange, sometimes absurd, sometimes genuinely beautiful history of human courtship has been working toward all along. It has not been answered yet. But people are still, in every generation, trying to find a way. Somewhere in the landscape of modern dating, between the committed relationship and the casual acquaintance, a new category of romantic arrangement took hold, one that had no formal name for most of human history, because the social structures of previous eras had not permitted it to exist long enough to require one. The situationship, a romantic entanglement with the emotional texture of a relationship and none of its acknowledged terms, sustained by mutual implicit agreement not to ask the question that would force a definitive answer. Two people spending significant time together, communicating daily, developing genuine feeling for each other, and carefully, persistently avoiding the conversation that would require either of them to say what any of it meant. The situationship is a product of the same conditions that produce ghosting and swipe culture, a romantic environment in which commitment has become optional, and the cost of not committing has been reduced to manageable social awkwardness, rather than the economic and reputational catastrophe it might have represented in earlier eras. When there was no acceptable alternative to formal courtship ending in marriage, ambiguity lasted days before social pressure resolved it. When ambiguity can be sustained indefinitely without external consequence, some people sustain it indefinitely. The logic from inside one is entirely coherent. Defining the relationship requires both parties to say what they want, which means both parties becoming vulnerable to the possibility that what they want does not match. As long as nothing is defined, nothing can be refused. The arrangement continues, warm and companionable, and the question of whether it is going anywhere remains safely theoretical. You are together enough to enjoy the benefits of closeness. You are undefined enough that neither party has technically promised anything. It is, from a certain angle, a masterpiece of emotional risk management. From another angle, it is a way of having a relationship with someone while denying them the dignity of being in one. What the situationship costs, and it does cost something, eventually, is almost always paid by the person who wanted more and waited too long to say so. The architecture of the arrangement is not neutral. It tends to favour the person with less investment, because the person with more investment is the one absorbing the uncertainty, doing the interpretive labour of reading signals and managing the gap between what the relationship feels like and what it is formally acknowledged to be. That labour is invisible and real, and accumulates over time into a weight that the relationship's pleasant surface does not account for. What's historically interesting about the situationship is that it represents, in some ways, the logical endpoint of the rejection of formal courtship rituals. Previous generations had elaborate systems for making the status of a relationship legible: the calling card, the dance card, the going steady pin, the engagement announcement. These systems were often stifling and unequal, but they did one thing with reasonable efficiency. They told everyone, including the people inside the relationship, where things stood. The situationship is what you get when all those legibility mechanisms are removed and replaced with nothing. When the only way to know where you stand is to ask, and the social atmosphere around dating has made asking seem like an unreasonable imposition. People who have been in situationships tend to describe them with a specific retrospective clarity, an understanding, visible only in hindsight, of exactly when they knew it wasn't going anywhere, and exactly how many additional months they spent finding out the same thing on a weekly basis. It is one of the defining romantic experiences of the current era, which probably says something about the era, though exactly what remains, fittingly, undefined. For most of human history, love was a local phenomenon. You fell for someone within the radius of your daily life, your village, your neighbourhood, your parish, your workplace, because those were the people you encountered with enough frequency to develop genuine feeling for. The occasional exception, the merchant who fell for a woman in a distant city, the soldier who corresponded with someone he had met briefly and then left, was unusual enough to be noteworthy and difficult enough to sustain that it usually resolved one way or the other within a reasonable period. Long-distance love was not a lifestyle, it was a temporary problem awaiting a geographical solution. Modern technology has changed this so thoroughly that long-distance relationships are now a recognised and fairly common feature of romantic life, with their own vocabulary, their own specific challenges, and their own substantial literature of advice about how to manage them. Two people can meet online, develop a relationship conducted entirely through screens and speakers for months or years, and feel, with some justification, that they know each other deeply and well, before they have ever been in the same room, before they have ever navigated the small frictions of shared physical space, before they have any data about what the other person is like at the end of a long bad day when there is nothing to perform for. The video call has done more to make long-distance romantic relationships viable than anything that preceded it, including the telephone. The telephone gave you voice, tone, warmth, the sound of someone laughing. The video call gives you face and movement and the visible context of someone's life, their apartment, their bookshelves, the way they gesture when they're excited about something, the expression that crosses their face when they're trying to say something difficult. It is not the same as being in the same room, but it is enough of the same that feelings develop and sustain in ways that a telephone line alone could not reliably produce. What long-distance relationships require more than anything the early stages of proximity-based courtship demanded is deliberateness. When you cannot be spontaneously present in each other's lives, cannot stop by, cannot meet for an unexpected coffee, cannot be in the same physical space without significant planning and often significant expense, every act of connection has to be chosen consciously. You schedule calls, you plan visits, you decide, repeatedly and explicitly, that this person is worth the specific ongoing effort of maintaining closeness across a distance that makes closeness effortful. There is no coasting. There is no being together by default. Everything is on purpose. This enforced deliberateness is, in a counterintuitive way, one of the things that long-distance couples often report as a strength of their early relationship. The fact that they could not take each other's presence for granted meant they never did. That every conversation was valued because it was arranged rather than assumed. That the relationship developed a quality of intentionality that proximity-based relationships sometimes only develop much later, if ever. The reunion visit carries its own weight. The first time two people who know each other well in one medium discover whether that knowledge translates into actual physical comfort with each other, whether the ease of the screen survives the reality of the same small apartment for a week, whether what they have built across the distance is real enough to exist without it. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the distance, it turns out, was doing more structural work in the relationship than either party had realized. But when it holds, when the ease survives the translation, there is a specific quality of relief and recognition that people who have experienced it describe as unlike anything else. The person you knew is also this person. They are the same. You were right about them. Across all that distance, you were right. So, here you are. At the end of a very long story about a very human problem, the problem of finding someone in a world full of people and convincing them to stay. You've travelled a long way tonight. From the arranged match negotiated over land and livestock, through the chaperoned parlour and the calling card left on a silver tray, through bundling boards and breach of promise lawsuits and the dangerous scandal of a waltz, through love letters that took a week to arrive and answering machines that recorded your nerves for posterity, through soda fountains and drive-ins and going steady and the slow, creeping arrival of a world in which you could fall in love with someone you had never seen, through nothing but words on a screen, in the dark, at 2 a.m, and through all of it, through every era, every ritual, every elaborate social mechanism that humans invented to manage the terrifying business of wanting someone and not knowing if they wanted you back, the thing underneath stayed exactly the same. The wanting, the hoping, the careful, vulnerable act of showing someone who you are and waiting to see what they do with it. That has never changed. Not once. Not in any of it. Think about the woman in the Victorian parlour, sitting upright in an uncomfortable chair, trying to communicate genuine feeling through the only channels available to her. A chosen word, a particular glance, the slight additional warmth in a goodbye that she hoped he noticed. Think about the man on the frontier, writing a letter to a stranger hundreds of miles away, describing himself as honestly as he dared, and sending it into the silence, waiting weeks for a reply that might never come. Think about the teenager in the 1980s, standing in the kitchen with the phone in their hand, rehearsing what they were going to say, dialing, hearing it ring, and feeling their heart do that specific thing that hearts do when the line picks up. They were all doing the same thing you have done, the same thing everyone around you has done or is doing right now, somewhere, in whatever form the current moment makes available, reaching towards someone, hoping to be reached back. History tends to record the grand things, the wars, the revolutions, the collapsing empires. It is less diligent about recording the Tuesday evenings when someone worked up the courage to say something honest to another person, and the other person said something honest back, and something began. But those moments are in the record too, if you look. In the preserved love letters and the folded calling cards and the dance cards with the same name written twice against the supper dance. In the breach of promise testimonies and the matrimonial advertisements and the video dating tapes that nobody watched more than once. In all of it, underneath the costumes of whatever era produced it, two people trying to find each other. They mostly didn't have the tools you have. They mostly had fewer choices, less freedom, and social consequences for missteps that would seem extraordinary to us now. They were also, many of them, braver than the tools required, braver than the parlour visit demanded, braver than the love letter called for, braver than the system they were operating within had been designed to accommodate. Because the wanting was bigger than the system. It always was. So tonight, as you settle into whatever warmth surrounds you, maybe spare a quiet thought for all of them. The bundled colonists and the jilted Victorians, the lonely hearts who wrote to a box number and waited, the people who danced a waltz when it was still considered scandalous and felt something real in 3 minutes on a crowded floor, the ones who got it right and the ones who didn't, who kept trying anyway, who loved imperfectly and hopefully across every era that history has recorded. They were, all of them, just trying to find the person worth finding. And somehow, stubbornly, generation after generation, they kept on trying. Sleep well.